Dallas-Fort Worth. This is North Texas in Focus. This show takes a closer look at issues and concerns around the Metroplex. We bring you the show on 88.1 Indy and 881indy.com.
Hi, I'm Matthew Reyna. This is North Texas in Focus, formerly known as McKinney in Focus. My guest on the program today is Texas State Representative Jasmine Crockett, who represents District 100 in the Texas House of Representatives. D100 is a sprawling urban district that stretches from West Dallas to far northeast Dallas and the western tip of Mesquite. Representative Crockett is currently seeking a promotion from voters. She's the Democratic nominee for the United States Congress in Congressional District 30. She is running with the endorsement of retiring incumbent Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson, who has represented the district since 1993, the year I was born. Crockett will face 4 opponents in the November 8th general election, including Republican James Rogers. Crockett is heavily favored to keep the seat in Democratic hands, as the district typically votes for Democrats by overwhelming margins. Congresswoman Bernice Johnson was reelected by more than 57 points when she ran for reelection in 2020. I spoke to Representative Crockett on Monday afternoon, and we had a wide-ranging discussion about inflation, predictions for the midterms, and whether she thinks President Joe Biden should be the Democratic standard bearer in 2024. I started out our discussion by asking Representative Crockett to introduce herself to those who haven't followed her work in Austin.
It's been wild. I don't really know how else to put it, except for we are living in some really crazy and different times. And I think that the districts that I run to represent recognize that it was probably time for something different to be in elected office. And so I essentially ran for the state house out of frustration. I normally practice criminal law as well as civil rights work is another thing that I do. And I really got frustrated. And honestly, I kept saying, we're in the midst of a modern day civil rights movement. And that was before George Floyd was killed. And in the midst of that campaign, George Floyd then was killed, and we saw protests throughout the world. And so I think that people decided to take a chance on maybe something that was a little bit different. And after taking a chance on me, definitely my House district would have been happy to have me back for sure. Many of them are sad about not being in my congressional district. But I was pretty shocked. You never know who is paying attention is what I tell people all the time. But I literally didn't know who was paying attention. And there were a lot of people paying attention. And one of those people included the Congresswoman who decided to retire and ultimately asked me if I would run for her seat.
And as you're running for her seat and getting around the district, what do you think is the top issue facing the people of Dallas right now?
Definitely the economy. And so that cuts into so many different categories. When we talk about the economy, that's affecting people's ability as it relates to childcare and what they can and can't afford, whether or not they can afford to go to work, because it may be more economically advantageous to just stay at home and take care of your kiddos instead of sending them to childcare. And so then they're out of the workforce. We also have a huge housing issue. And so the economics surrounding that ends up being a problem as well from those that just can't get financed to get into a house. And then obviously we saw that the interest rates have shot up, which is making it even more difficult. But the supply chain issues that we were experiencing pretty much at the beginning of COVID that we're still experiencing has driven the cost of housing up. And so we are lacking in affordable housing for sure. Obviously, inflation in and of itself, while we just had the Inflation Reduction Act, nothing happens overnight. And so it takes a while to start to feel the positive impact of something like that. But obviously, we were experiencing record inflation, yet we hadn't experienced an increase in wages. And so definitely the economy and the things surrounding the economy are number one for those in my district. And I would argue probably number one in this country.
When you're in a district that's so heavily Democratic and you win the Democratic primary, I guess how do you even campaign? Because if I won the Democratic primary in your district and I was a Democrat, I would already be having cards that said congressman coming in the mail. So, I mean, how do you avoid complacency in this general?
Um, it's definitely tough. I don't know that complacency is really one of those things as part of my vocabulary. Regardless, I mean, especially when you look at congressional seats, you run every 2 years, right? So you need to kind of get into that mode, and this is kind of just working and paying it forward for cycles to come, because the general is going to have a lot more people voting it than voted in the primary and the primary runoff. And so there's still a number of people that may not be familiar with me, that need to get to know me. What's probably most difficult for me is that I am a team player. Everything that I do recognizes that, hey, I'm only one of a larger body, right? And so for Congress, it's one of 435. And so I'm only one person, right? I get nothing done by myself. And so probably what's most difficult is that I am trying to key in on big races that are not so deeply blue in this country, so that hopefully we don't lose the majority, which means that I can actually function. So I've been very focused on that. I've been very focused on the statewide as well, because of the gerrymandering that took place during our last session, whichever special session number that was. That's affected like our state Senate. Like, we're just screwed. It's affected pretty much the majority of Congress. We're just kind of screwed. The state house, we have some rules in place that help us. And so the state house doesn't have to be just a net loser. I don't really see the activity around the state house that I wish if I was still in the state house, the activity that I would be drumming up. But I am really concerned about the U.S. House, the U.S. Senate, as well as our statewide ticket. And because redistricting kind of doesn't affect somebody running statewide, I'm really trying to work closely with Beto's team and really get rid of our governor. So my biggest deal is I've got opponents that think they have a shot. And so, they want to waste my time with things that just aren't productive for the district, and aren't productive for kind of the bigger picture of hopefully keeping us in a majority, however tight that majority may be.
So speaking of the fact that you're only one person and you're going to have to build coalitions when you're in Congress, when you're representing a metro area like DFW, I can assume that, you'd want to build a rapport with colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and be the best regional coalition you can be. But when so many of the delegation from DFW on the Republican side are election deniers and things of that sort, how do you build effective regional coalitions with people like that?
Yeah, so I mean, most people would be shocked that the person that was ranked as being having the most liberal bill filing and voting record in the state house was me. But being liberal in Texas just doesn't really take very much. I do want people to understand that it just doesn't take very much. Like, you just say, hey, I don't want to go back to slavery. And it's like, you're liberal. And so, that was independent sources, right? Saying this girl is the most liberal. But when the Congresswoman announced that she was retiring, the very first sitting congressional member to text me and say you should run was a Republican. And so what people don't understand is that there's a lot more performative politics that takes place on the other side of the aisle. And by that, I mean, there are people that are putting on a performance because they know that they have an audience, i.e. Donald Trump. And so they do things that they don't really believe. I'm not saying that there aren't those that do believe it, because there are those that have drunk the Kool-Aid for sure. But it's hard to tell like who's like legit and who is like, nah, I'm just doing this to keep Trump off my back, right? Like, you don't know unless you're kind of on the inside. And so I think on those things that are not created to be hyper partisan things, which I never thought math or science would be hyper partisan, but that's the world we're living in right now. So, on some of the economic things, I think that we'll be able to really get some things across the finish line. One of the biggest bills for my district that was bringing in about $70 million for Fair Park, a Republican had to carry that bill for me. But those down in Austin, they didn't realize, what area we were talking about. And so because she carried it, they were like, oh yeah, and they voted for it. And I'm like, this is so stupid, right? But it didn't matter to me. I just wanted the money to come to the district. And so it didn't matter if I was the one that was like in front of them pushing the bill, because I just wanted to get it done. And so I think that there will be a lot of scenarios like that, where, even if it's something where they just don't want to vote for it because my name is the one that's at the top, I'll have some folk that most likely will be able to assist me. One of my classmates who swore into the House with me, he's in DC as well. So, I think I'll be okay. But I am definitely not a fan of where we are in this country. And I think until we do something about Donald Trump, I think we'll continue to see just like this deterioration. Or if for some reason, the only reason we hold on to the majority in the House is because in the primaries, they elected these Trumpers and all these Trumpers lose in the general, then maybe they'll say, well, maybe that phase is over. Maybe we can go back to being kind of like normal Republicans.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. I mean, I think the conventional wisdom that I hear is that Democrats more than 50% chance probably hold the Senate and less than a 50% chance of keeping the House. Where do you assess that? What do you think things look like the day after Election Day?
Yeah, if for some reason, if this wasn't a redistricting year, I would tell you for sure we would hold on to the House and probably pick up some seats. But as we've kind of dealt with crazy court after crazy court, we're definitely in a disadvantaged situation as we dealt with really them ripping apart the Voting Rights Act and us not reauthorizing that whatsoever. It really makes it so much more difficult because we don't have the legislation on the books that we need to protect these seats going forward, or to make a racist state like Texas be subject to some sort of oversight, right? And so that does make it more difficult, right? This is how Republicans play. They just cheat. But when you see a state like Alaska go to a Democrat after 50 years, you're like, okay, miracles can happen. So, I honestly, I look at these numbers. One of the hopefully incoming freshmen that I hope to get up to the St. Louis region to campaign for, she's on the other side in Illinois. And so she gets East St. Louis. And so we're going to try to get my friends and family who have not come to Texas to block walk for me, but I'm going to try to get them to go and block walk for Nikki Budinsky. And I'm planning to travel up there and do a big block walk for her. She's in a tight seat. And because of kind of the way things have been going, she actually may get that seat. We also saw that they elected a Trumper in Michigan in a seat that they were thinking was kind of 50-50, and it shifted to us. And so I think that we've got some shots. I think we've got shots that we're not even looking at right now. I really do believe that the Dobbs decision is going to backfire in ways that they just didn't see. And so I look forward to it. I don't think, not every state was put in a situation where they could draw lines as badly as they drew them in Texas. Texas is either blue or red. There really is no middle ground for the majority of the seats. I mean, they either got bluer or they got redder. So, you think about somebody like Beth Van Duyne, who only won her seat by 1 point, and it was a seat that Biden actually won. That particular seat, she's now maybe got 5 points, a 5-point advantage, right? So, who knows? It depends on who shows up. We're seeing a record number of young people registering to vote, and we're seeing a record number of women in general getting involved. And we are also seeing a record number of Republicans that said enough is enough, and they're flipping over. So I do think that we may end up with some positive surprises, and we only need a couple of races that nobody even had on their radar to flip, and we'll be good to go.
And beyond the Congress, do you think one of those positive surprises could include the Texas governor's race?
I do. I absolutely do. It's interesting because everybody kept saying, who's going to run for governor? Who's going to run? And it's like, there's nobody else who's even in a position to run, right? Like, it could have only been Beto. When you think about the fact that Texas is 30 million people, I mean, the amount of money and time that it takes to set up the infrastructure to run that kind of race, it can't just be anybody. I mean, it's just impossible. And so he has the fundraising ability above and beyond probably anybody else that would have run for that seat. He had been organizing and continuing to build an infrastructure ever since he started building in 2018. And so I think that there's a shot. Do I think we have the best shot? No, but I think this is the best shot that we would have. And I think that Beto is definitely poised to do it. My biggest concern is the Valley. I think we're going to do our part to turn out in bigger numbers in the urban centers. I think the urban centers are a little bit more motivated because of Dobbs. And people like me who are I'm in a safe Democratic seat, but I've got 4 opponents, and I definitely can't fumble on the 1 yard line. So we're going to actually spend money. So there may be people that maybe weren't necessarily that motivated by Beto, but maybe they'll be motivated by me that are in my district. And so when they come out, that will help him. And so I'm trying to encourage other Democrats in safe Democratic seats to really target their districts and try to pull them out. And basically, historically, Beto has helped the bottom of the ticket, right? Like, he swept candidates in all over the state. We were flipping seats on the Court of Appeals. That was all Beto bringing people in. Well, now it's time for us to do our part and help Beto. And we need to spend a little money and bring in our own constituencies. And hopefully that will help him to get the governor's seat.
And I'll wrap with this question. President Biden, he's had probably the best legislative last, few months of his presidency. But before that, a lot of people were questioning whether he'd be the Democratic nominee in 2024. If it was up to you, would President Biden run again in 2024?
Listen, I will tell you this. I have never run for president, and God bless those that do. But I will say that, I don't think that we should treat the president any other way than we've treated any other president. If he decides that he wants to run for re-election, then we get behind him and we support him, period. And, I can't say that I've understood all the madness. We very rarely do. There's always things that are going on behind the scenes that we, the general public, aren't a part of. But I can say that I don't remember in my lifetime anybody forgiving really any large amount of student loans, period. I don't remember that happening, right? And I know that there are those that want more, but I'm like, I don't remember it happening ever. Nothing like this. This was a historic thing. We know that there was a historic amount of investment that was made as it relates to infrastructure, which translates into money. We know that we just had a historic amount of investment made into green or moving us towards a greener future, right? Green energy, green jobs. There was a historic amount put into that because we know that climate change is actually real. And so that came out of our infrastructure bill. That came out of the inflation bill. We also know that for the first time, we had somebody clap back on the pharmaceutical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry may not be the happiest right now because we're putting some caps on the cost of drugs in this country. And so, you know what? If you really, I think the Democrats are terrible at communicating. I think most people don't realize that President Biden has put more African Americans on federal benches than all presidents combined. I think that most people don't realize that he invested a historic amount of money into our HBCUs. And so we know that when we get a president that's Democratic, we know that Black people didn't stay home. We know that they finally came out, right? When you look at Michigan or Ohio, people always say, well, Detroit stayed home, or they say, oh, Detroit came out, right? And that tells you which way that state is going. And so while I know that there's a lot of Black folk that are still reeling and still hurt because, as I mentioned before, the Voting Rights Act has not been reauthorized, right? We didn't get the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We didn't get anywhere on the Freedom to Vote Act. And these are things that would have put us in better positions to really elect the representation that we choose right now, this cycle. But we're handicapped. Many of us have at least one hand, if not two hands behind our backs. And for so many of our strong voting base demographics, they remember marching. They remember being there, potentially on Bloody Sunday or somewhere else. And so I know that they're hurt by that. But I think overall, this president is delivering. And so if he decides that he wants to run for re-election, then I think that we all need to unite behind him and make sure that he gets reelected.
You're listening to North Texas in Focus on 88.1 Indy or 881indy.com. If you have something you'd like to hear addressed on a future show or any questions, you can send email to info@881indy.com. That's info@881indy.com.
I would like to thank today's guest, State Representative Jasmine Crockett, for her time and thank her campaign staff for setting up the interview. The 2022 midterm elections will take place on November 8th, 2022. The last day to register to vote in Texas is October 11th. If you would like to register or are unsure if you are already registered, visit votetexas.gov. For useful information on early voting and polling places in your community, visit your county elections website. For KNTU's North Texas in Focus, I'm Matthew Reyna. Thanks for listening.
This has been North Texas in Focus on 88.1 Indy and 881indy.com. If you have questions or information to share with us, you can send email to info@881indy.com. Thanks for listening.